Keep the change, the CEO said without looking up, sliding a thick stack of cash across the table as if it weighed nothing, as if it meant nothing. And for a moment, the entire restaurant seemed to breathe a little quieter, not because of the money, but because of the way he said it, like a challenge dressed as generosity, like a test no one had agreed to take. Clara Bennett didn't respond right away. She stood there with her order pad still in hand, her posture straight, her expression unreadable, the soft hum of clinking glasses and low conversations wrapping around her like a distant echo, because she had heard tones like that before, not loud, not rude, but certain, the kind of certainty that came from a man who believed he already knew how the story would end. Daniel Whitmore finally glanced up, his sharp blue eyes meeting hers for less than a second before drifting back to his phone, already dismissing her, already filing her away as predictable, just another variable in a world he controlled with numbers, contracts, and quiet assumptions. Clara looked at the money then, not with surprise, not with excitement, just a measured glance, as if she were reading something written between the bills, something invisible to everyone else in the room, and her fingers tightened slightly around her pen before relaxing again, slow, deliberate, controlled. 8 hours into her shift, her feet ached, her shoulders carried the familiar weight of exhaustion, and somewhere in the back of her mind sat a number she couldn't ignore, rent due in 3 days, a bill folded neatly in her apron pocket, a reminder that life didn't pause just because someone decided to play games with it. Still, she didn't move. Not yet. Daniel smirked faintly, the corner of his mouth lifting as if he had already won something unspoken, because in his world, everyone reacted eventually. Everyone revealed themselves when the right number was placed in front of them, and he had built an empire on that belief, on the quiet conviction that people, at their core, could be measured, predicted, bought. Clara exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, then reached forward, not hurried, not hesitant, just precise, and picked up the cash. The movement was simple, but it shifted something in the air, subtle, like the first drop of rain before a storm no one sees coming. A man at the next table glanced over. A server paused mid-step. Daniel didn't look up, but his fingers stopped scrolling for half a second, just long enough to register the change. Clara turned away without a word, the money now in her hand, her pace steady as she walked toward the back of the restaurant, past the polished bar, past the quiet glances, past the assumptions already forming in other people's minds. No explanation, no apology, just silence. And for the first time that evening, Daniel Whitmore looked up again, his eyes following her retreating figure, something unfamiliar flickering beneath his calm exterior. Not doubt, not yet, but curiosity, the kind that doesn't come from answers, but from the uncomfortable realization that maybe, just maybe, the story isn't going the way you expected. Clara did not go to the register, and she did not head toward the manager either. Instead, she moved past the polished counter and into the narrow hallway that led to the back, where the noise of the dining room softened into something distant and muted, like a world she had already stepped out of, and for a brief second, she stopped, the stack of cash still resting in her hand, heavier now, not because of its value, but because of what it represented, a choice, a line, something that could not be undone once crossed. Down the hall, a quiet voice broke through the stillness, low and strained, a young woman standing near the employee exit, her phone pressed to her ear, her words rushed, almost whispering, "I understand, but I just need until tomorrow, please." And Clara's eyes shifted, taking in the scene without intruding, the tension in the woman's shoulders, the way her hand trembled slightly as she listened, nodding even though the person on the other end could not see her. Clara did not ask questions, she never did, but she understood enough, because she had stood in that exact place before, caught between pride and necessity, between asking for help and pretending everything was fine. The call ended, and the woman lowered her phone slowly, staring at the floor as if waiting for it to offer an answer, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching just long enough to matter. Clara stepped forward, her movements calm, controlled, and she extended a portion of the cash, not all of it, just enough, her voice steady when she finally spoke. "Take this." And the woman looked up immediately, confusion flashing across her face, followed by hesitation. the kind that comes when something feels too unexpected to trust. I cannot, the woman said softly, shaking her head, but Clara did not pull her hand back, her expression unchanged, her eyes clear, not pleading, not insisting, just certain. It is not a gift, Clara replied, her tone even. It is a solution for today. And something in the way she said it made the resistance falter, not disappear, but soften, just enough for the woman to reach out slowly, her fingers brushing against the bills as if they might vanish. I will pay you back, she said quickly, almost urgently, but Clara shook her head once, a small motion, barely noticeable. Just move forward, she said, and that was all. No lecture, no explanation, no need to justify what she had done or why she had chosen to do it. The moment passed quietly, like it had never been meant for anyone else to see, and Clara turned, the remaining cash still in her hand, her steps measured as she walked back toward the dining room, toward the man who believed he understood outcomes, toward the table where assumptions were waiting to be confirmed. Out on the floor, Daniel Whitmore had not returned to his phone, not fully, his attention fractured, his gaze drifting more often than he would admit, replaying the moment she took the money, analyzing it, categorizing it, trying to fit it into something familiar, but it did not settle, it did not resolve, and when Clara reappeared, walking with the same quiet composure she had left with, something shifted again, subtle but undeniable, because whatever he had expected, it was not this version of her, not this calm, not this absence of urgency or guilt or anything that would make her predictable. She approached the table without hesitation, placed a small portion of the remaining cash down beside the check, aligning it neatly as if it were just another part of the service, and for the first time, Daniel did not reach for it immediately, his eyes lifting to meet hers, searching, calculating, and finding nothing he could easily define. Daniel did not touch the money, not right away, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table as if the distance between him and those bills had suddenly become significant, measurable in something other than inches, and for a man who had spent his entire life reducing complexity into numbers, into outcomes he could predict and control, this moment resisted him, quietly, stubbornly, refusing to resolve into something simple. You kept part of it, he said finally, his voice calm, but no longer dismissive, no longer careless, and Clara did not flinch at the observation, did not rush to defend herself or explain. She simply stood there, composed, her hands resting loosely at her sides, her gaze steady without being confrontational. I used part of it, she replied, her tone even, and that single word shifted the frame, subtle but precise, not kept, not taken, but used, and Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in focus, the way they did when something did not fit the model he had already built in his mind. That was not your decision to make, he said, not harshly, but with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to setting boundaries others did not question, and for a brief moment, the space between them held that expectation, the familiar pattern where the other person would step back, apologize, adjust, but Clara did not move. You left it, she said, just as calm, just as measured, and there was no edge in her voice, no challenge, just a statement, simple and complete, and something in that simplicity made it harder to dismiss. Daniel leaned back slightly, studying her now, really studying her, not as a server, not as background, but as a variable he had underestimated, and that realization did not sit comfortably. So you decided to play the hero, he said, a faint trace of skepticism slipping into his tone, but even as he said it, the words felt insufficient, like they belonged to a different conversation. Clara shook her head once, a small movement, almost imperceptible. No, she said, I decided not to waste it. And again, the language shifted, reframed, forcing him to reconsider the premise he had started with. Around them, the restaurant continued as if nothing had changed, glasses clinking, quiet laughter rising and falling. But at their table, something had altered, something neither of them named, because it did not need to be named to be felt. Daniel glanced down at the remaining cash, then back at her, his mind working through possibilities, scenarios, motivations, but none of them settled cleanly, none of them aligned with what he had expected when he placed that money on the table. And the rest, he said, gesturing slightly, you brought it back. And Clara nodded once, not as a confirmation, but as a completion of something already understood. "It was never mine," she said. And there it was, not a defense, not an excuse, just a line, clear and unmoving. And Daniel felt something shift again, deeper this time. Not curiosity, not quite discomfort, but something closer to recognition, the kind that does not arrive fully formed, the kind that lingers just beneath the surface, waiting to be acknowledged. He had expected a reaction, a mistake, a moment that would confirm what he already believed about people, about limits, about the quiet price everyone carried. But instead, he was left with something else entirely, something he could not easily measure, something that did not fit into profit or loss or advantage. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel Whitmore found himself without a conclusion. His certainty interrupted not by confrontation, but by a woman who had simply refused to play the game the way he designed it. Daniel let out a slow breath, almost unnoticeable, but it carried something with it, a shift, a subtle crack in the certainty he had walked in with. And he reached for the glass of water in front of him, not because he was thirsty, but because he needed a pause, something to anchor the moment while his thoughts rearranged themselves into something that made sense again, except they did not the way they usually did. "Do you always do that?" he asked, setting the glass back down with quiet precision, his eyes still on her, no longer casual, no longer detached. And Clara tilted her head slightly, not confused, just considering the question itself, as if she needed to understand what exactly he meant before answering. "Do what?" she asked, her voice steady, and Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second, an unfamiliar delay, before continuing. "Decide what money should mean," he said, and there was something different in his tone now, less assumption, more inquiry, the kind he rarely used outside of boardrooms where answers translated directly into strategy. Clara's gaze did not waver, but something softened in it, not emotion exactly, more like clarity, as if the question itself revealed more about him than it did about her. "Money means what people need it to mean," she said, and the words landed quietly, without emphasis, without performance, but they lingered, filling the space between them in a way that felt heavier than any argument could have. Daniel leaned back again, slower this time, his fingers tapping once against the table before going still, because that answer did not fit into the categories he was used to. It did not divide neatly into right or wrong, gain or loss, and he found himself replaying it, turning it over, searching for the angle he was missing. "And what did it mean to you?" he asked, and this time, there was no edge at all, just curiosity, raw and unfiltered, something he had not intended to show. And Clara glanced briefly toward the hallway she had come from, just for a second, before looking back at him. "It meant someone did not have to lose something today," she said, and she did not elaborate, did not explain who or why, because she did not need to. The statement stood on its own, complete, and for the first time, Daniel felt something settle uncomfortably in his chest, not guilt, not yet, but the outline of it, the possibility of it. He looked down at the money again, the portion she had returned, neat, untouched, and for the first time, it did not look like leverage, it did not look like a tool, it looked incomplete, like something that had already been transformed into something else before it ever came back to him. Around them, a burst of laughter rose from another table, glasses clinked, life continued in its usual rhythm, but Daniel felt disconnected from it, as if he were observing it from a step removed, aware now of something he had not been paying attention to before. "You could have kept all of it," he said, almost to himself, the words quieter now, less of a statement, more of a realization, and Clara gave a small nod, acknowledging the obvious without attaching meaning to it. "Yes," she said simply, and that was all, no pride, no denial, just truth, and that simplicity unsettled him more than any defense would have. He had expected negotiation, justification, maybe even gratitude twisted into obligation, but instead, he was faced with something that did not seek his approval at all, something that operated entirely outside the system he trusted. Daniel looked up at her again, really looked this time, not at her uniform, not at her role, but at the quiet steadiness behind it, and for the first time that evening, he did not feel in control of the narrative he had started. He had set a test, carefully, deliberately, expecting a result that would confirm what he already believed, but instead, he was left with something else entirely, something that did not confirm anything, something that questioned everything. And as Clara turned slightly, preparing to step away and continue her shift as if nothing significant had happened, Daniel realized that whatever answer he had been looking for when he placed that money on the table, it was no longer the one he needed. Clara turned away as if the conversation had reached its natural end, her steps quiet, unhurried, blending back into the rhythm of the restaurant like she had never stepped out of it at all. And for a moment, Daniel remained still, watching her move between tables, greeting guests, refilling glasses, her expression unchanged, her presence steady, as if nothing about the last few minutes had altered her pace or her focus, and that, more than anything, unsettled him. He was used to impact, to visible reactions, to the subtle shifts people made after interacting with him, a little more careful, a little more eager, a little more aware of who he was. But Clara moved through the room untouched by any of that, as if his test had never carried weight in her world to begin with. He reached for the remaining cash again, finally, lifting it from the table and turning it slightly in his hand, the edges still crisp, the surface unchanged, yet it no longer felt like the same thing he had placed down minutes ago, because now it carried context, something he could not separate from the image of her walking down that hallway, choosing something he had not anticipated. He exhaled slowly, then reached into his jacket, pulling out his wallet, sliding the returned bills inside with a precision that felt almost mechanical, as if restoring order to something that had slipped out of place. But the order did not return. It lingered, that slight imbalance, that quiet disruption in his thinking, and when his phone buzzed on the table, he glanced at it, a message from his assistant reminding him of a call in 20 minutes, a deal that would move millions of dollars with a few signatures and a well-timed decision, something that normally would have commanded his full attention, but now, the screen dimmed without a response. His gaze drifted again, almost involuntarily, finding Clara across the room, laughing softly at something a customer had said, not forced, not exaggerated, just real, and he noticed the way she listened, not waiting to speak, not calculating, just present, and that detail, small as it was, pressed against the edges of his thoughts in a way he could not ignore. He stood up slowly, adjusting his jacket, not with urgency, but with intention, his chair sliding back with a soft sound that barely registered in the surrounding noise, and he walked toward her, not as a customer this time, not as someone issuing instructions or setting expectations, but as someone trying to understand something that did not fit into his usual frameworks. Clara noticed him before he spoke, her eyes lifting briefly, acknowledging him without surprise, without hesitation, and she finished her sentence to the table in front of her before stepping aside, giving him her attention in the same measured way she had from the beginning. "You changed the outcome," he said, his voice lower now, more controlled, but carrying something different beneath it, not authority, not assumption, something closer to recognition, and Clara regarded him for a moment, as if weighing the statement itself rather than the man delivering it. "No," she said quietly, "I chose mine." And the distinction landed cleanly, without resistance, without force, and Daniel felt it settle deeper than anything else she had said so far, because it was not about him, not about his test or his expectations. It was about something entirely separate, something that existed whether he was there or not. He nodded once, a small motion, not agreement exactly, but acknowledgement, and for the first time that evening, he did not try to correct the narrative, did not try to reshape it into something that served his understanding. He simply let it stand, incomplete, unresolved, and strangely, that felt more honest than any conclusion he could have forced. Daniel did not leave the restaurant right away, even though his schedule demanded it, even though his phone buzzed again with another reminder that his time was supposed to belong elsewhere, because something about this moment refused to be filed away as insignificant. And for a man who measured his life in decisions that led to outcomes, this felt like a decision that had no clear return, and that alone made it impossible to ignore. He stepped back slightly, giving Clara space to return to her work, but his mind did not move with her. It stayed fixed on the quiet certainty in her words, on the way she had separated herself from his influence without resistance, without effort, as if it had never existed in her world to begin with. He moved toward the front of the restaurant slowly, not rushed, not distracted, just thoughtful, his gaze occasionally drifting back, not searching for her attention, but for understanding, something he rarely needed from anyone. At the register, he paused, his fingers resting lightly on the counter as he looked down at the receipt, the total clear, precise, expected, and for a moment, he considered leaving another stack of cash, something larger this time, something that would shift the balance back into a space he understood, but the thought dissolved almost as quickly as it formed, because now he knew it would not work, not with her, not in the way it always had before. Money, in this moment, had lost its leverage, and that realization sat heavier than he expected. Clara approached the counter a moment later, her expression unchanged, professional, composed, as if this were any other transaction, any other customer, and she placed the finalized check in front of him with the same quiet precision she had shown all evening. "Your receipt," she said simply, and Daniel nodded, glancing at it briefly before looking back at her, not with authority this time, not with expectation, but with something closer to respect, though he did not name it. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked, the question coming without calculation, without the usual filter he applied before speaking. And Clara paused for just a second, not because she was unsure, but because she was considering how much of an answer he actually needed. "Regret what?" she asked, her tone steady, and Daniel exhaled softly, as if clarifying the question for himself as much as for her. "Choosing like that," he said, and there was no judgment in his voice, only curiosity, real and unguarded, the kind that rarely surfaced in him outside of high-stakes decisions. Clara held his gaze for a moment, then shook her head slightly, a small, certain movement. "No," she said, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any explanation could have, because it was not defensive, not justified, it was just true. Daniel studied her for a second longer, then gave a faint nod, acknowledging the answer without trying to dissect it. And he reached into his wallet, this time pulling out his card, placing it on the counter with a motion that felt almost symbolic, as if he were stepping back into a system he understood, even if part of him now questioned it. Clara processed the payment quickly, efficiently, the routine smooth and familiar, and when she handed the card back, their fingers did not touch, not by accident, but by design, maintaining the same quiet boundary she had held from the beginning. "Thank you," she said, her voice calm, and Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second before responding, not because he did not have the words, but because he was choosing them more carefully than usual. "No," he said finally, his tone lower, more deliberate. "Thank you." And for the first time that evening, the words did not feel like politeness. They felt like acknowledgement, quiet and real. And as he turned to leave, stepping out into the cool evening air, the noise of the restaurant fading behind him, Daniel Whitmore carried something with him that had nothing to do with money, nothing to do with control, something far less tangible, and far more difficult to ignore, the unsettling awareness that for all the systems he had built, for all the patterns he had mastered, there were still choices in this world that existed entirely beyond his reach, and that realization, quiet as it was, stayed with him longer than any transaction ever had. The night air felt different when Daniel stepped outside, cooler than he remembered, sharper somehow, as if the city itself had shifted while he was inside, and he paused on the sidewalk for a moment longer than usual, his car already waiting at the curb, the driver stepping out slightly as if to open the door, but Daniel raised a hand, a small gesture, telling him to wait. He looked back once, not dramatically, not with hesitation, just a brief glance through the glass where the warm light of the restaurant still glowed, where Clara moved between tables with the same quiet rhythm, already absorbed back into a world that did not revolve around him, and that detail stayed with him longer than he expected. He slid into the back seat finally, the door closing with a soft, controlled sound, sealing him back into the environment he understood, leather seats, muted lighting, a screen already displaying his upcoming schedule, but for once, he did not reach for it. The car pulled away smoothly, merging into the flow of traffic, headlights stretching into long lines ahead, and Daniel leaned back, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular, replaying the evening not as a sequence of events, but as a series of moments that refused to settle into a clear narrative. He had tested her. That part was simple, predictable, something he had done in different forms his entire career. But the result did not match the pattern, and that was where it stayed, unresolved, pressing against the edges of his thinking. His phone buzzed again, more insistent this time, and he picked it up, glancing at the name on the screen, then answering without shifting his tone, his voice returning to its usual calm authority as he discussed numbers, timelines, projections, decisions that would move millions of dollars before the end of the week. And yet, even as he spoke, part of his mind remained elsewhere, replaying a different kind of transaction, one that had nothing to do with profit or leverage. "We will finalize it tomorrow," he said, ending the call with precision, the conversation efficient, controlled, exactly as expected. But when the line went silent, the quiet that followed felt different, heavier, filled with something that had not been there before. He looked down at his hands for a moment, then at the reflection in the window beside him, his own face looking back, composed, successful, unchanged on the surface, and yet, something about it felt incomplete, as if he were seeing a version of himself that had been left unquestioned for too long. The car slowed at a red light, the city glowing around him, people crossing the street, conversations happening, lives moving forward without calculation, and Daniel found himself noticing it in a way he usually did not as background, not as noise, but as something real, something not measured or controlled. He exhaled slowly, then reached into his jacket, pulling out his wallet again, opening it just enough to see the cash he had placed there earlier, the same bills, unchanged, and yet now they carried a different weight, not financial, but symbolic, a reminder of something he had not been able to define. He closed the wallet and leaned back, his eyes drifting shut for just a second, not from exhaustion, but from thought, and in that brief pause, a realization began to take shape, not fully formed, not complete, but present enough to matter. He had always believed that understanding people meant predicting them. That control came from knowing how they would respond when pressure was applied, when incentives were introduced, but Clara had not responded. She had chosen, and that difference, small as it seemed, disrupted everything he thought he knew. The light turned green, the car moved forward, and Daniel opened his eyes again, looking out at the city with a new kind of awareness, not clarity, not certainty, but something quieter, something more honest, the beginning of a question he had never needed to ask before, and for the first time in a long time, he did not rush to answer it. The next morning did not begin differently, at least not on the surface, because Daniel Whitmore woke at the same time, followed the same routine, wore the same precision in his movements that had defined his life for years, yet something beneath that routine had shifted, quiet but persistent, like a question that refused to be dismissed. His office overlooked the city, glass walls framing a skyline that usually reminded him of control, of reach, of everything he had built and could still command. But today, the view felt less like ownership and more like observation, as if he were standing slightly outside of it for the first time. His assistant moved through the morning schedule with efficiency, outlining meetings, numbers, decisions waiting to be made, and Daniel listened, nodding when appropriate, responding with clarity, but his attention did not anchor the way it normally did, because every decision, every projection seemed to echo against something simpler, something from the night before that had no numbers attached to it. "The acquisition terms are ready for your approval," his assistant said, placing a folder on his desk, and Daniel opened it, scanning the pages, the language familiar, structured, predictable, a system designed to eliminate uncertainty. And yet, he paused, his eyes resting on a clause that would reduce costs by cutting a small group of employees, a decision he had approved countless times before without hesitation. He leaned back slightly, his fingers still on the paper, and for a moment, he did not calculate, he did not project outcomes or returns, he simply considered, something he rarely allowed himself to do without purpose. The memory of Clara's voice surfaced, not loudly, not dramatically, just present. It meant someone did not have to lose something today, and the simplicity of that sentence cut through the complexity of the document in front of him in a way that no data ever had. He closed the folder slowly, not rejecting it, not approving it, just pausing, and his assistant hesitated, sensing the shift but not understanding it. "Hold this for now," Daniel said, his tone calm, but different, less immediate, and she nodded, stepping back without question. The room fell quiet again, the city stretching beyond the glass, and Daniel stood, walking toward the window, his reflection faint against the skyline, And for the first time in years, he did not see just a result, just a man defined by outcomes. He saw the absence of something he had never measured. Across town, Clara moved through another shift, tying her apron, adjusting the small details of her uniform, her routine unchanged, her focus steady, unaware of the ripple her quiet decision had created beyond the walls of the restaurant. Because for her, it had never been about impact, never about being seen or remembered. It had been about a single moment, a single choice, complete in itself. Back in the office, Daniel turned from the window, his gaze settling on the desk, on the neat arrangement of files, numbers, decisions waiting for him to resume control, and he stepped forward, but slower this time, more deliberate, as if each movement carried weight beyond efficiency. He picked up his phone, not to respond to the waiting messages, but to open something else, a blank note, and for a moment, he simply looked at the empty space, the absence of structure, before typing a single line, not for anyone else, not for any meeting or report, but for himself, something he had not done in years. He stopped after a few words, reading them again, not because they were complex, but because they were unfamiliar, and then he set the phone down, exhaling quietly. The day would continue, meetings would happen, decisions would be made, but something had changed in the way he would approach them, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to matter, enough to begin reshaping a pattern he had never questioned before. And somewhere in that shift, subtle and unfinished, Daniel Whitmore began to understand that the most significant changes did not come from control, but from the moments when control quietly failed. Daniel returned to the restaurant 3 days later, not out of habit, not out of convenience, but because something unfinished had stayed with him, quiet but persistent, and as he stepped inside, the familiar sound of conversation and movement met him again, unchanged, steady, as if nothing had shifted in the world since he left, and in many ways, it had not. Clara was there, just as before, moving between tables with the same calm efficiency, her presence blending into the rhythm of the room, not seeking attention, not avoiding it, simply existing within it. And when her eyes met his briefly, there was no surprise, no recognition of significance, just acknowledgement, the same as any other customer. Daniel chose a table this time without expectation, sitting down not as someone testing a system, but as someone stepping into it without control, and when Clara approached, her voice carried the same quiet professionalism. "Good afternoon," she said, and Daniel nodded. The moment simple, almost ordinary, except it was not for him. He placed his order without deviation, no test hidden beneath it, no challenge waiting to unfold, just a meal, just a transaction, and Clara noted it down with the same steady hand, the same measured pace, before stepping away. There was no tension, no anticipation, just the absence of something that had defined their last interaction, and Daniel realized, slowly, that this absence mattered more than anything he could have orchestrated. When she returned with his coffee, setting it down gently in front of him, he spoke again. Not to provoke, not to measure, but to understand something he had not been able to articulate. "I changed a decision this morning," he said, his voice calm, not seeking approval, not offering explanation, just stating it as it was. And Clara paused for a moment, her eyes meeting his, not curious, not impressed, just present. "Then it mattered," she replied, and there was no emphasis in her words, no attempt to assign value beyond what already existed, and Daniel nodded slightly, because for the first time, he understood that meaning did not need to be expanded to be real. He reached into his pocket, not pulling out cash this time, not placing anything on the table as a test or an offer, but simply resting his hand there for a moment before letting it fall back to his side, the gesture incomplete by design. "I thought I understood people," he said after a pause, the words quieter now, less certain, and Clara tilted her head slightly, not in disagreement, but in acknowledgement of the thought itself. "You understand patterns," she said, and the distinction landed softly, but clearly, separating something he had always considered the same. Daniel let out a small breath, something close to a quiet laugh, not of amusement, but of recognition, because she was right, and the simplicity of it made it impossible to argue. He looked down at the table for a moment, then back at her, his expression no longer searching, no longer trying to resolve anything into a final answer. And you, he said, you do not follow them. And Clara gave a small shake of her head, her voice steady as ever. No, she said, I choose when they do not apply. And that was all. No explanation, no expansion, just a boundary, clear and self-defined. The moment settled between them, not as a conclusion, but as something complete in itself. And when Clara stepped away again to continue her work, Daniel did not stop her, did not try to extend the conversation beyond what it had already given him, because for once, he did not need more. He finished his meal in quiet, paid his bill without hesitation, and as he stood to leave, he glanced once more at the room, at the movement, at the quiet presence of someone who had never tried to prove anything, and yet had changed something fundamental without effort. Outside, the city moved as it always did, fast, precise,